Yes, thank you, Beth. Appreciate the introduction. Very happy to be here with all of you. Just a bit about my role at Accenture. I work across teams to establish our strategic priorities for North America that ultimately help Accenture attract, develop, retain, and advance our diverse talent. I prepare our gender and ethnicity workforce demographic goals. We ultimately want our company to reflect the demographics of where we live and work. And I oversee some key areas of the team, our employee resource groups, our professional development offerings, and our I&D partnerships. So thank you all again for your interest in the work that we do. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to participate in this event. So as Beth mentioned, I was asked to come talk a little bit about how Accenture is reducing bias in our processes. I thought I'd start by first talking a little bit about the foundation that Accenture has in place that really allows us to tackle topics like bias reduction in meaningful and impactful ways that has strong leadership support. So first and foremost, inclusion and diversity are top business imperatives for our CEO. There are a variety of reasons for this. Not only is it the right thing to do, but our clients and the customers of our clients are diverse. We have to be a diverse organization to create solutions that are meaningful for them. Second, diverse companies achieve stronger returns and we're more innovative. So our own research really shows that equality drives innovation and performance. If we advance one more slide, much like other companies represented on this call, we have publicly stated diversity goals outlining what the composition of our workforce should be over time to better reflect our communities. So our leaders are held accountable for achieving these goals and measured accordingly. So progress against the goals are tracked with the same rigor as other key metrics like sales and revenue. This is an important point because having this leadership accountability ultimately will garner support for efforts like bias reduction. The presence of bias will erode inclusion and therefore diminish progress against these goals. I also want to call out, we heavily leverage metrics and advanced analytics to understand where bias could be at play when it comes to hiring, developing, promoting, rewarding, and staffing our people onto project teams. So we assess if there is parity or, unfortunately, disparity between minority and majority populations. The idea is that proportionally, underrepresented populations should be hired, promoted, retained, et cetera, at the same rate as majority populations. So our leadership teams are primed to review this data on a regular basis. The last piece is our culture. It's infused with an awareness, of what bias is and how it shows up. Neuroscience tells us that if you have a brain, you have bias. So we can't get away from it. It's almost impossible to be completely unbiased. So to that end, and as many companies are doing, based on all the great research the CAHRS team has done, unconscious bias training. It's important. It does build that awareness. And it's also more effective when it's supported by interventions that address bias as it happens. So I'll talk a little bit more about this shortly in my presentation. Also, all of our US people are required to take mandatory training to identify and report racism. And this was a new development that was implemented just this past year. So the last piece I'll mention before I kind of dive in, we have a strong willingness among our people to self-identify their gender, ethnicity, if there is a disability at play, if they have their military status, LGBTQ status, and all of these data points are essential to understanding the needs of our workforce. So we have to understand, who's out there and what the needs are. So I will say that having the underpinning of leadership accountability, this culture of awareness, and the deep analytics helps create the appetite and leadership support that is needed to take action to eliminate bias from our talent lifecycle. So I will spend just a little bit of time now sharing examples on how we're doing this. So on top of the routine metrics that can quickly show areas of disparity, deeper analytics help us determine the root cause. So for example, in the hiring process, we analyze the likelihood of minority versus majority populations to progress through each stage of the application, interview, and offer stages. So as areas of opportunity are uncovered, we can more effectively implement the right behavioral nudge. So identifying the root cause is critical. In this example, we could have originally been thinking, wow, we need to get more diverse pipelines. But in reality, after reviewing the analysis, the pipeline is strong, but the disparity actually starts to creep up in the interview stage, just as an example. We also heavily rely on metrics to support our staffing process. And this is activated once someone joins our company and needs to be staffed on a project team to support our clients. So the routine metrics can quickly uncover disparity in terms of how long minority versus majority populations are sitting on the bench, waiting to be staffed on a project. But deeper analytics can offer more around the root cause. So for example, we can pursue a deeper analysis to determine if there are certain factors that correlate to the length of time someone's waiting to be staffed on a project. Is it the presence of a profile picture on an internal resume? Is it the tenure? Are they an experienced hire or someone who's kind of grown up in the company? Is there a correlation based on the college that this individual went to? So once all of these root causes are uncovered, actions can be taken. In the case of staffing, we've actually even taken things a step further by partnering with neuroscientists to help us really further assess where we can tackle bias in this process. So now I just kind of want to switch gears and talk about examples of the behavioral nudges that help address bias in our company. And I'll start with an example again from the hiring process. As Dara talked about earlier, we're one of the companies that carefully assesses job descriptions to make sure they are inclusive. So for example, if we were to include a statement like prior consulting experience required in our descriptions, then we have to ask ourselves, is this really true? A statement like this could automatically limit the pool of candidates to the demographics of the consulting industry. Another example from our performance management process, which I know some questions came up around earlier. We've run a few pilots where we've trained a new role called an equality champion. And that person is present during talent discussions to ensure a couple things. They want to make sure that equal time is being spent discussing each person's contributions. And then they specifically listen for different types of bias. So they consider whether comments or decisions would be considered fair if roles were reversed. So for example, if the individual was of a different gender or a different race, a culture, ability, or background, and they're not there to accuse people of bias. They're really there to ask questions and just, really be intentional about whether or not bias is being introduced into a process. So wrapping up, I think overall what we found that works well is, building awareness with our key decision makers and leaders around how and where bias can creep in, showcasing data that validates instances of bias, and then encouraging small behavioral shifts for real-time interventions. Hopefully this has given you a better sense of how Accenture is tackling bias, and Beth and team, thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Yolanda. Before we buck it over to Sarah, a couple questions did come in, so I'll direct those to you, Yolanda. Sure. First one was, how do you differentiate target goals by function? So for example, do you have greater focus on underrepresented people in technical positions? What does Accenture do there?
I wouldn't say it's targeted by function, but what I will say is that, when it comes to gender, the country and the demographics, for example, the US is pretty much split half and half, male, female. But when it comes to ethnicity, that's a little bit more unique because there are certain, clearly, parts of our country that do have a greater pool of ethnically diverse talent. So some of that could be more, location-led decision-making and prioritization. So it's really, we let the demographics, I guess, drive our strategy there.
Okay. Yeah, another one is about addressing data privacy concerns regarding self-identified data outside the US. How are you thinking about that at Accenture?
From a, gender perspective, I mean, there are very clear data privacy laws that are governed, and our employees do know what their data can and can't be used for when it's disclosed. In terms of gender, that's pretty much, we're able to track that globally. When it comes to ethnicity, there's really only 3 countries where we're able to pursue that information, the US, the UK, and South Africa. So that's where we're tracking the ethnicity data. In terms of other kind of the other diversity dimensions, military status, LGBTQ status, having a disability, that is more distinct and unique geography by geography. There are different laws that govern the ability to collect that data.
It's complicated, yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of questions came in too on this interesting idea of equality champions. How do you decide who should serve in those roles? How do you prepare them and train them?
That's a great question. Thanks for all of these questions. So for an equality champion, it's really anyone who's involved in the decision-making around the performance management process. And ultimately, the entire set of decision makers are trained and enabled to serve as equality champions, but then we designate one person as on point to really be honing in and listening for those conversation topics to, ask those questions that really uncover where bias might be creeping into a conversation. So it's really everyone's job to serve as an equality champion who's part of those discussions, but we do give that designation specifically to one person to really monitor it and keep everyone on track.
Okay. And I'll ask one more question and then we'll go to Sarah. So someone asked, what specifically triggered you to engage with neuroscientists to eliminate bias during the recruitment process? Were you seeing that you had low diversity numbers? What prompted that?
It's really just, Accenture, we're just pursuing all avenues to see, are there areas that we can uncover that can help us do better? It's not to resolve any kind of, known deficiencies or address anything in particular, but it's an avenue that we are willing to explore in order to be the most knowledgeable, caretakers of our people when it comes to bias. I mean, it's something that we definitely want to make sure is eliminated, mitigated in any way possible. So this was an interesting space that we wanted to explore.
Okay, terrific.